Budget Policy Statement, introduction of the Adjustments Appropriation Bill, introduction of the Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendment of Revenue Laws Bill, introduction of Taxation Laws Amendment Bill.
I now recognize the Honorable the Minister of Finance. Dati.
Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, President of the Republic of South Africa, Cabinet colleagues, Deputy Ministers, members of the Executive Councils here present, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank and Deputy Governor, leaders of all political parties in this democratic parliament, representatives of organized business and labor, honorable members, fellow South Africans. Today is my singular honor and privilege to table the 23rd medium-term budget policy statement of the democratic era. This is the first budget policy statement of the sixth administration and parliament. The medium-term budget policy statement is an important piece of the budgeting process. The first statement, if I might remind members, was published on the 2nd of December 1997 during the first democratic administration led by President Utata Nelson Mandela. Today we publish the medium-term budget policy statement containing, number one, a summary of government's fiscal goals and objectives. Two, projections for the economy and the public finances. Three, long-term projections of the debt to GDP ratio, assuming different scenarios. The baseline projection assumes we make minimal policy changes. For a fiscal risk statement. The medium-term policy statement does not include detailed spending plans or tax proposals. That is for the annual budget, which is normally introduced in February. If I may just pause here to emphasize that this is not the budget, because many people at home are thinking that today Minister Mboweni is presenting the budget. That is not the case. So let's temper down the expectations. So no request for further monies or anything else. The medium-term budget policy statement that we table today coincides with another important government process, the tabling of the tax bills. I am grateful to the Standing and Select Committees on Appropriations and Finance that which have the responsibility for steering the consideration of the tax bills, giving effect to the revenue proposals as announced in the 2019 annual budget in February, and obviously the related tax administration matters, as well as the 2019 Division of Revenue Amendment Bill and the 2019 Adjustments Appropriation Bill. As the 1997 policy statement said, and I quote, "There is no point publishing a policy statement if it simply means publishing the budget 3 months earlier. The purpose is to open up the debate before the actual budget is finalized," unquote. I look forward to this debate. I will follow this debate in person, on the wireless, on TV, in the newspapers and other media. We had a lot of debate about the wireless. I table this medium-term budget policy statement for consideration of the House and of all South Africans. Today, I also table the Adjustments Appropriation Bill, the Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendment of Revenue Laws Bill, the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill, the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill, the Tax Administration Laws Amendment Bill, and finally, the 2019 Adjusted Estimates of National Expenditure. Deputy Chair, on Budget Day 2019, I brought a resilient aloe ferox plant. Mr. President, on a cheeky note, let me say that you might remember that I also presented to Your Excellency an aloe ferox plant, which I'm very confident that it is still alive and growing, because its health and growth signifies an important element of the South African economy. This little aloe ferox is emerging from a long winter. During that winter, the ground became hard, the leaves fell from the trees, and the air was bitterly cold. We toiled, hoping for better days. Our people became poorer. Some of them lost their jobs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, here we stand at the end of winter. The food cupboards are almost bare. We have been shuffling about in old and comfortable brown shoes. Our expenditure continues to exceed our revenue. Our national debt is increasing at an unsustainable pace. The economy is not performing that well. In these difficult times, we have turned against one another, unfortunately. We have regrettably turned against our brothers and sisters from the rest of the continent. We should inculcate in the minds of our people that we are all Africans. Worst of all, we have turned against our sisters, our daughters, and our mothers. This is not who we are. We should give renewed impetus to the fight against gender-based violence and xenophobia. So what should we do? Hope is good, but it is not a strategy. As any farmer will tell you, if you want a bumper harvest, you must be prepared to work hard during the end of winter and early spring. Because what you do to the soil then determines how successful your crop will be. Now is the time. We cannot wait any longer. If we want a successful harvest, we must act today. Mr. President, so that I don't disappoint, let me say, as the good book says, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 2, I think. If you want to reap sparingly, you must sow sparingly. If you want to reap bountifully, you must also sow bountifully. Unquote. Amen. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. As I've said somewhere, we need to rock the boat. We need to shake the baobab tree. We need to do the unusual. We need to disrupt the comfort zones to get things moving. What is the state of the world? After a decade-long economic expansion, growth in advanced economies is expected to slow, in part due to trade tensions and the Brexit uncertainty. The International Monetary Fund estimates that these tensions may take away 0.8 percentage points from global growth. Economic growth in both China and India is expected to slow to about 6.1% this year. Growth in both these countries accelerated after far-reaching structural reforms. The average person in China today is 7 times richer than 25 years ago. The average person in India has become 3.5 times richer over the same period. Meanwhile, the average South African is only 1.3 times better. Growth in emerging markets is lower partly because of the global slowdown, but also due to domestic policy missteps, which we can avoid. Economic growth in Mexico is down sharply. Its own state-owned energy company, Pemex, will cost approximately $2.6 billion a year to fix. The Brazilian economy will most likely grow at 0.9% in 2019. There, the state-owned energy company, Petrobras, has its own big problems. Closer to home, things are much better. The African continent has a young, growing, entrepreneurial population. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow by 3.6% next year, the second fastest growing region after Asia, excluding Japan. Like Eliud Kipchoge, the Kenyan economy is racing ahead, but not at that speed. Growth is expected in Kenya to be 6% next year. In Ghana, after extremely difficult structural reforms, growth is expected to be 7.5% this year and 5.6% next year. Ethiopia is expected to grow by over 7% in this period. They clearly have new shoes. Why don't we? In the first quarter of this year, the South African economy contracted by a revised 3.1% on a seasonally adjusted and annualized basis. As energy constraints lifted, growth rebounded to 3.1% in the second quarter. These two quarters canceled each other out, and this year, growth has been flat. There are some signs that investment spending is strengthening. In the second quarter, growth in gross fixed capital formation rebounded to 6.1%. Mining grew by 14.4%. In real terms, credit growth has been positive since late 2018. Private sector credit extension rose 6.2% in September. Home loans grew 5% year on year, the fastest rate in some time. But corporate credit extension has softened, which is an issue of concern. In September, headline consumer price inflation was 4.1%. Lower inflation is good for everyone, particularly the poor and the working class. In short, what we have here is a mixed picture with some positive signs. It is our job to chart a course that is sober, strategic, and inclusive. The economy is now forecast to grow at 0.5% in 2019 compared to 1.5% expected in February. Growth is projected to slowly rise to 1.7% in 2022, a situation which is not pleasing at all. Fellow South Africans, the preamble to our Constitution gives us a commitment by all to do the following. Quote, improve the quality of life of all citizens, and free the potential of each citizen, unquote. The growth outlook is far too low to support this vision of the founders of our democratic society. We therefore need to accelerate economic performance. Under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, the structural reform agenda contained in the National Development Plan has been given a new life. We have made progress in the following. Firstly, the new integrated resource plan has been gazetted. Second, the infrastructure fund is being rolled out. Third, the visa regime has been greatly simplified. Fourth, the unabridged birth certificate requirement for young tourists has been abolished. Fifthly, we have upgraded a number of industrial parks and 10 special economic zones have been approved. 6, Cabinet has directed ICASA to accelerate the leasing of high-demand broadband spectrum, and we are falling behind schedule in the race for 5G. Our paper titled Economic Transformation, Inclusive Growth and Competitiveness Towards an Economic Strategy for South Africa draws lessons from fast-growing emerging and sub-Saharan African economies. The paper speaks for itself, but in brief, we argue that there are a number of important growth ingredients. Firstly, an efficient and capable state. Second, prudent fiscal and monetary policy. Third, a competitive and flexible exchange rate. 4, a trade regime which promotes open and beneficial trade, particularly with the rest of the African continent. 5th, a reimagined industrial strategy. 6, opening a network industries platform, that is transport, logistics, and telecommunications. This means reorganizing ESCOM and other state-owned entities. 7th, lowering barriers to entry. The president yesterday spoke to me and my colleagues at length about 2 difficulties that he has in life. One, it took him 3 years to obtain a water license on his property. 3 years. And now it's taking him an endless amount of time just to flatten the ground outside his house for parking, because permission from the city of Cape Town is difficult. 8, prioritizing job-creating sectors such as agriculture and tourism. 9, an overarching legal framework with an independent judiciary and strong property rights. 10, a well-functioning banking and financial sector. The country is having a rigorous debate about these proposals. We received over 103 comments so far. Proposals included ideas on, for example, the digital economy, streamlining applications for new ports, and opening up the railway network to force heavy freight off our roads to ease congestion and improve safety. Mr. President, your comment at the first meeting of the President's Council of Economic Advisors was, and I quote, "Implementation of these initiatives will improve confidence and restore credibility," unquote. To judge from the many supportive comments received, many South Africans agree with you, Mr. President, as do local and international business, large and small. I coined a new phrase. It's called large, small, medium, and tiny. Tiny businesses. Thank you to everyone who joined in the debate, who wrote letters, held conferences, wrote articles in various publications, and issued press releases. We can do some of the things urgently. Already the new integrated resources plan charts a greener course forward on energy. We can accelerate spectrum licensing and move towards 5G. We can make it easier to do business. Mr. President, a critical youth employment initiative has been driven by yourselves. We have supported the Youth Employment Service, known as YES, through expanding the Employment Tax Initiative. We look forward to the YES Initiative board bringing forward new innovative ideas. Today we publish version 2 of the document. It is a living document, and as such, it is, quote, not a dogma, but a guide to action, unquote. That reminds me of my young political days. Where appropriate, we will consider legislation. To meet our fiscal needs, growth is not enough. We also need a well-functioning and efficient revenue collection agency. The South African Revenue Service is emerging from its own winter. Cabinet has approved that we implement the findings of the Nugent Commission of Inquiry into Tax Administration and Governance. And I intend to table a bill early next year in this regard. The President has appointed Mr. Edward Kieswetter as the new Commissioner of SARS. Since he started work in May, he has already taken steps to reinvigorate and re-establish the large business center unit and the litigation, integrity, and compliance units. Leadership, staffing, and procurement failures are also being addressed. Achieving a more inclusive South Africa relies on honest taxpayers. Without your taxes, fellow South Africans, our country will not succeed. Thank you to all those who have honored their obligations thus far, but we have a few more hours to complete your tax returns. Because we must render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, or else Caesar has a tendency of breaking your bones. But you have told us, fellow South Africans, that we must spend your hard-earned money better, and we could not agree more with you. We now expect to collect 1.37 trillion rand this year. This is 53 billion rand, or 4% less than what we expected. Looking forward, our revenue forecasts are prudent. We assume an elasticity of 1, which means a 1-to-1 relationship between growth in taxes and economic growth after adjusting for tax measures. We are assuming an elasticity of 1, which means a 1-to-1 relationship between tax, growth in tax, and economic growth after adjusting for tax measures. You can Google it in the meantime. The fiscal framework has weakened substantially since the February budget, mainly due to weaker economic growth and lower revenues, as I tried to explain the formula above. The main changes to the in-year expenditure projections are, firstly, 26 billion rand in additional financial support to Eskom. Secondly, 11 billion rand to several smaller state-owned companies in financial distress. Thirdly, 430 million rand approved through the budget facility for infrastructure for student housing. These increases are partly offset by drawing on the contingency reserve, provisional allocations, and declared unspent funds. That said, savings from the compensation measures announced in the budget in February have not materialized as expected. Thus, in total, non-interest spending rises by 23 billion rand this year relative to the February estimates. If we exclude ESCOM support, non-interest spending would have been 2.9 billion rand less than expected. The consolidated budget deficit is now projected at 5.9% of GDP in the current year. I just need to explain this to people in the media who have seen a different picture. This is a consolidated number that you're seeing now. This year, the national debt exceeded 3 trillion rand. It exceeded 3 trillion rand. It is expected to rise to 4.5 trillion in the next 3 years. Clearly, we need to do things differently. As things stand, without any policy adjustments, debt will most likely exceed 70% of GDP by 2022-23. This is a serious position that we find ourselves in. Our little Arlo Ferox is not doing very well, Mr. President. It needs attention, like our public finances. Honorable members, there's no status quo option. Stabilization involves difficult decisions that imply sacrifices by all of us. Slowing growth in the compensation bill and additional revenue measures will be needed. The consequence of not acting now will be grave for South Africa. Over time, the country would likely face mounting debt service costs and higher interest rates and may enter a debt trap. The unemployment crisis would worsen and government debt could balloon. This is an outcome we all are determined to avoid. Additional measures will be announced in the 2020 budget. I say this, Mr. President, deliberately because we need to understand that this medium-term budget statement does not propose tax policy changes. But in February, we'll deal with the tax policy changes in order to allow us to balance our books much better. Over the medium term, consolidated government spending totals 6.3 trillion as things stand. That is ceteris paribus. Our priorities are education, social development, and health. These receive 3 trillion over the next 3 years. Approximately half of non-interest spending goes to national government and the other half to provinces and municipalities. We have achieved many social gains over the past 25 years. Our social spending programs can be sustained over the long term, provided we make reasonable and prudent choices. On our current trajectory, by the end of the 3-year framework, debt service costs will be bigger than spending on health and economic development. Our problem is that we spend more than we earn. It is as simple as that. How will we fix it? Because we are a leadership, we are not a complaining society. To stabilize debt, government will target a primary balance by 2022-23. Primary balance means that your revenue and expenditure, that must give you a number of 0%. Now I'm helping you because I can see you're struggling. The target measure excludes support to ESCOM because that is part of a separate process. As a first step, we have identified spending reductions of 21 billion rand in 2020-21, 29 billion rand in 21-22, mostly, unfortunately, in the area of goods and services and transfers. In addition, non-interest spending in the outer years of the framework is constrained in line with the consumer price inflation. That said, if we want to achieve our target, we'll need to find additional measures in excess of 150 billion rand over the next 3 years, or about 50 billion rand a year. How will we do this? We'll need to deal with the challenges of the wage bill, state-owned companies, executive remuneration and benefits, and fiscal leakages. In the review accompanying this statement, we set out a detailed analysis of spending on public sector wages. It shows that, it's an interesting figure actually, it shows that 29,000 public servants, plus members of the National Executive, members of Parliament, members of the provincial executives and so forth, each earned more than 1 million rand last year. So they become millionaires. This is more than double the number of civil servants earning more than 1 million rand in 2006-07. So when members of the DA shout up and down, you must know that it's because they are concerned about their status. The average wage increases across government was 6.8% in 2018-19, or 2.2% in above inflation. After adjusting for inflation, the average government wage has risen by 66% in the last 10 years. We look forward to robust discussions in the relevant bargaining structures and with other stakeholders to achieve a sustainable solution. We are all in this together. In the same breath, we would like to send a message to state-owned companies, public entities, and the private sector, the boards of directors and executive management on compensation and benefits, which must be managed downwards. The President has issued a directive which will apply to members of Cabinet and members of the provincial executives as follows. Firstly, for the foreseeable future, Cabinet, Premiers, MEC salaries will be frozen at current levels, with the likelihood of further negotiations. 2, the cost of official cars at national, provincial, and local level will be kept at 800,000 VAT inclusive. 3, a new cell phone dispensation will cap the amount claimable from the state. 4, all domestic travel will be on economy class. 5, the Minister of Finance will make a determination on the appropriate use of subsistence and travel for all arms of the state. I encourage, listen carefully, Mr. Deputy Speaker, listen carefully. I encourage the leadership of Parliament to think about applying the same rules. In the 2019 budget, some measures were announced. This included, 1, a program to ease the wage bill. 2, the national macro reorganization of government. 3, reducing performance bonuses, freezing salaries for members of the executive and parliamentarians, amongst others. Unfortunately, these have not been fully realized as savings. The early retirement program has only yielded so far about 4,000 volunteers. We will need to reinvigorate this process. We must also wean state-owned companies off the national budget. They must learn to stand on their own feet. Government has announced a comprehensive set of structural reforms for Eskom, as announced by my colleague, Minister Gordon, and also reforms in the energy sector, which we are supporting with 230 billion rand over the next 10 years. Very difficult budget adjustments have been made. To meet unanticipated cash needs, we have brought forward 26 billion rand in 2019-20, 33 billion rand in 2020-21, and 10 billion rand in 21-22. Further delays in operational reforms could mean additional demands on an already strained fiscus. We cannot continue to throw money at Eskom, I think everybody agrees. For the sizable support required, it cannot obviously be business as usual. In our view, Honorable Deputy Speaker, Eskom must do the following. 1, run their current plant and equipment better. 2, achieve other operational efficiencies, including better cash management. 3, fast-track the separation of the utility into the 3 parts as endorsed by the political principles. There should be no doubt about these policy decisions. We have come this far, and we have to complete the race. The Minister of Public Enterprises has elaborated on this when he presented the Eskom paper yesterday. Going forward, suppose this is probably the most important announcement of this speech. Going forward, new cash flow support will no longer be based on equity, but will be in the form of loans. Going forward, any form of support to state-owned enterprises will no longer be in the form of equity, but loans. And a loan needs to be repaid with interest. Once I'm convinced that the Eskom board and management have made an irrevocable commitment to the implementation of the government decisions and that there is enough progress, we'll negotiate the appropriate size of debt relief. Eskom is a business, and it should be run like a business. Now, SAA is unlikely to ever generate enough cash flow to sustain operations in its current configuration, which then begs the question, how long are we going to be on this flight path? I think we can fix things, and we have the capability and capacity to do that. Operational and governance interventions are required urgently. I am pleased, honorable members, to learn that there are conversations involving SAA and potential equity partners, which will liberate the fiscus from this SAA sword of Damocles. We have essentially chosen to subsidize the middle class and wealthy to fly around the country and other parts of the world, rather than subsidize ordinary workers who sit in old trains from the townships every day, often getting stuck in the train and arriving late for work. I think there's an honorable member who got stuck in the train here, I won't mention. We are also subsidizing the wealthy bond holders who hold government-guaranteed debt but receive higher yields without additional risk. That's when we borrow to finance our activities. Cabinet has considered several options to resolve the impasse over the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project. The reconfigured approach to the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project and its financing will be determined by the Ministers of Finance and Transport after consultations with the Premier of Gauteng and the Executive Council. Further details will be provided by the Minister of Transport. But, honorable members, not paying your tolls is not an option. We therefore have to ensure that we honor our obligations. I urge the nation to pay for bills for services rendered. We need to build a culture of payment, as government services can only be sustained if we all pay what is due. Now, Deputy Speaker, other state-owned companies that require support from the fiscus will be subject to certain preconditions. One, government as a shareholder commits to the highest standards of corporate governance. Two, managers and their teams should not receive bonuses or salary increases when they fail to meet basic financial targets and service objectives. In fact, Deputy Chair, they should take a pay cut and in some cases be relieved of their duties. Three, and finally, business with outdated business models are a major fiscal risk and should be closed. It is critical to drive further infrastructure investment. Public sector infrastructure projects are plagued by poor planning and implementation. This comes out in underspending, which reached 20% of capital budgets last year. The Budget Facility for Infrastructure, a technical entity that reviews complex capital projects, has already strengthened its own capacity. In addition, government has made progress on a blended finance infrastructure model, which is what the President has been speaking about for a while. The fund will be hosted by the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and it will be led by an actual living human being, Dr. Sean Phillips. The implementation team for the fund is already at work. They have already identified policy and regulatory hurdles. A pipeline of possible projects amounting to more than 500 billion has been identified. Government has set aside 100 billion rand over the coming decade to finance projects and programs from this baseline number of 10 billion rand. Pilot projects receive 500 million in the current year. We're working with the private sector to fund this process. And I can report, Mr. President, that substantive conversations have already taken place with private banks and other institutions so that they can come to the party, and they are ready and willing to come to the party. We're making progress on improving the efficiency of the state. The state can use its budget much better. For example, and this is a good example, Mr. President, I was saying that the state can use its resources much better. For an example, the South African National Defence Force buys more than 900 million rand worth of food a year. So, in these difficult circumstances, the Chief of the Defence Force has informed me that they have started Operation Kuba Tlala, Operation Chase Away Hunger, which is a deliberate effort by our armed forces to buy food from nearby suppliers. As you know, the Defense Force has many bases around the country. So if they source their food from local suppliers, that just makes things much better. It removes the middle person and brings down the prices of these goods. Where possible, given budgetary constraints, we should encourage the whole government and parastatal system to do like the National Defense Force. Through reprioritization, the National Prosecuting Authority receives an additional 1.3 billion rand. This is important so that they can get the work of getting the criminals in jail. And the South African Revenue Service receives an additional 1 billion rand so that they can collect as much revenue as possible. These funding shifts will bolster efforts to combat corruption and improve revenue collection. Let me also say, Mr.
Point of order.
What's the point of
My humble
order?
apologies, Minister. Deputy Speaker, there's someone taking a video from the ANC benches there.
No.
With the flashlight taking a video and pictures there.
Honorable member, if you are doing that, you are out of order and you know it.
It is a member with the blue there. At the back, second row from the back.
And the whips will attend to that, please. We want to know who that is so that we act on them. Honorable Minister, please proceed.
I was interested in the mention of the color blue. Anyway, earlier this month, Cabinet approved that over 14,000 hectares of land will be released for human settlements development. The National Treasury has reviewed the procurement framework and has developed a public procurement bill, which will be considered by Cabinet very soon. The very simple issue about procurement in the government system is that we pay higher prices when we should not be. So therefore, we have to attend to this, Mr. President. It straddles from this notion of 3 codes, and then you appoint the lowest code. It applies to all kinds of bureaucratic mismatches, which lead us losing a lot of time and a lot of money. So we're reviewing all of this. I've listened carefully to colleagues who have made inputs about the rigidities in the Public Finance Management Act, but also listened carefully to Salga about the impact of the Municipal Finance Management Act. I've listened carefully to that, and we're going to be reviewing it. We're going to ask an independent judge to look at all these laws and see what to do with them, likely to be Judge Davis. South Africa rejoined the Community of Nations in 1994 and has played its part in advancing the peaceful international order. In these physically constrained times, we need to relook at the strategic value of all our international commitments without moving away from internationalism. The National Health Insurance Policy aims to provide health care to many South Africans. It is an urgent task that we are pursuing. There are ongoing conversations between the Ministers of Finance and Health and also between our respective departments. Parliament is also seized with the NHI bill. We will take stronger measures to fight illegitimate cross-border flows and tax evasion. Our approach to money laundering will be reviewed by the Financial Action Task Force. Steps are also being taken to strengthen cooperation between the Financial Intelligence Center, the FIC, the South African Revenue Service, and the South African Reserve Bank. To promote investment and reduce unnecessary burdensome approvals, by budget day next year, the South African Reserve Bank will have proposed a more modern, transparent, and risk-based approvals framework for cross-border flows. Rules on active currency hedging, loops, and mortgages for individuals living and working in South Africa will be reformed. To support regional integration, the holdco, the holding company regime, will be extended to all banks in the Republic. Mr. Deputy Chair, the South African Reserve Bank has, during a very difficult period, kept inflation stable. They have declared a substantial increased profit share to the government. The bank is a very strange creature of statute. Even though we do not own it, the National Revenue Fund receives 90% of the profits from the South African Reserve Bank after the bank has made provisions for ordinary items usually made by bankers. Last financial year, we received a profit share from the South African Reserve Bank of some 200 million rand. It is a very beautiful arrangement, Mr. President. We do not have to invest any money into the bank, but we get almost all the profits plus taxation. Madam Mr. Deputy Chair, that is my presentation today. Government proposes measures to grow the economy. In addition, we are committed to narrowing the deficit, raising the quality of spending, particularly on large infrastructure projects. As we do this, we trust that we have the support of the entire House. And the less politicized the budget policy statement is, the better for South Africa. I end my remarks as I began this presentation. The winter has been long, but we must prepare for spring and reposition the Republic to grow and to thrive. We need to plant good seeds for our country, both now and for the future. Honorable President, in June this year, you addressed this august House and made clear that the policy of our government is, I quote, prudent borrowing and stringent expenditure management to stabilize our public finances and lower the debt trajectory, unquote. That is the work that we must now do. That is what the South African public expect from us. We shall return to this House next February with the nation's beloved aloe ferox having flourished and show a government at work. As I conclude, Mr. President, without breaching the laws of protocol, may I wish the mighty Springboks all the best this weekend, and I think they will success. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Honorable members, I thank the Honorable Minister. The papers he tabled will be referred to relevant committees. That concludes the business of the day. The House is adjourned.